Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this panel. My name is Feliciano Guimarães. I'm the academic director of CEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel about U.S. and Brazil bilateral relationship and the issue of climate change and energy transition. We have a great set of panelists here with us. We have Ms. Alice Hill from the Council on Foreign Relations. Alice Hill is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations in U.S. Her work at the CFR focuses on the risk, consequences, and response associated with climate change. She previously served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director of Resiliency Policy on the National Security Council staff, where she led the developmental of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risks, including climate change and biological threats. And we also have our fellow Ana Toni from CEBRI. Ana is an economist and has a PhD in political science. She's currently the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Society, ICS. Ana is a co-founder of Public Interest Management, and she was board chair of Greenpeace International from 2010 to 2017. And has an experience in working in areas of public policy, advocacy, environment, and climate change. This panel is part of a larger project that we have with the U.S. Consulate in Rio. We have had a series of webinars and panels already. We're going to have more until the end of this year. And in this one, it's also focused on environment. So thank you, Ms. Alice and Ms. Ana, for being here with us. Now CEBRI has this new format. What we do is we have a more like a conversation. We come up with a couple of questions and Ms. Alice and Ms. Ana can answer, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation. All right, so let me start. So on August 2022, the United States Congress passed President Biden's climate tax and healthcare bill that proposes to inject more than $370 billion into climate and energy programs to cut emissions significantly until 2030. So Ms. Alice, could you give us an overview on the most important points and issues of such bill? And what is, in your opinion, what is your opinion on U.S. climate and environmental policy in the coming years? And how do you see this initiative affecting U.S. foreign policy in general and the potential cooperation with Brazil? Thank you, Ms. Alice, for your participation.
Oh, well, thank you. What a pleasure to be able to join you and to discuss this very important moment for both countries, for Brazil and the United States, as they lean in, I hope, to addressing the environmental and climate challenges that we have. Certainly, the Inflation Reduction Act is the most significant legislation that the United States Congress has ever passed with regard to climate change. The title might be a little misleading in what's really in there. What the bill contains is some health measures directed at reducing the price of drugs, for example, for seniors. But it includes, as you've said, about $370 billion directed at primarily reducing emissions so that the United States can honor its pledge of reducing its emissions from 2005 by 50 to 52%. And so this bill is based on carrots. It's not telling people what they can't do. What it's doing is shelling out huge amounts of money to inspire greater investment from the private sector in technologies that lead to clean energy and adoption of practices by consumers. So that would, for example, be heat pumps to heat our homes that are more energy efficient. It's also for incentives to purchase electric vehicles and build out the electric vehicle infrastructure throughout our nation so that people can drive longer distances using their electric vehicles. investments in hydrogen and in carbon capture and storage. There are also some minor investments in comparatively, they're still large in dollar amounts, but comparatively in resilience. Of course, we have a huge challenge with drought here. So there's several $billions directed to drought activities to improve outcomes in our Western United States, which is particularly challenged by drought. And there's some money for forest conservation, which should, we hope, help reduce the wildfire risk. Both of those risks, of course, are worsened by climate change, by the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere, causing the United States, as well as the rest of the globe, to heat up and then contributing to more uncontrollable fires, as well as deeper droughts. So it is a huge signal to the American people that we are serious about climate change here in the United States. Importantly, it's also a signal to the rest of the world. Of course, in 2015, President Obama joined the Paris Agreement, but then President Trump was elected and pulled the United States out of the UN negotiations about climate. President Biden came back and said the US intends to lead in this area. Until the Inflation Reduction Act, however, didn't have as much to show and as proof of its ability to lead, and now it has this act. So as we prepare and people are gathering and getting their visas to go to Egypt for the 27th Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework on Climate Change, it's anticipated that the United States will point to this Inflation Reduction Act as its proof that the United States is back and intends to lead in its role as historically the largest emitter and the second largest emitter now in trying to get a handle on the climate crisis. So it's hard to underestimate the significance in the history of the United States and its efforts to address climate change, the significance of this act, and also it's anticipated it will be significant on the world stage.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis, for your answer. As I mentioned before, I mean, this panel is part of this project with the U.S. Consulate, and the title of the project that I forgot to mention is "America in the World: The U.S. Foreign Policy and the Brazilian View of the Bilateral Agenda." So, in this regard, Ms. Anatoni, can you also comment on the relevance of this bill in regards to its potential to foster the bilateral relationship between Brazil and U.S.? Thank you very much for being here with us, Ms. Anatoni.
Thank you so much, Feliciano, and thanks for CEBRI for the invitation. It's really a big pleasure to be debating that with Alice Hill on the U.S. and as she said, historical bill on climate. For everything I read, has never been such a bill that is so significant from a U.S. government, which really shows the seriousness in which from the Trump administration that left the Paris Agreement to now approving this bill, it makes a huge difference. And I think it brings a very strong message for all over the world, which is the seriousness of U.S. government and U.S. industry to push for policies that leads to decarbonization. And I think it was very clever in the way you did it, which was not only the name, as you already mentioned, talking about inflation, that is something that the American people anywhere in the world would care as well, of putting inflation down. But from, I think, day one, from the campaign of President John Biden, he always mentioned the issue of climate change being an issue that would, if he would look at this issue, by being an issue that could bring jobs to the American people, that would put the American economy in a different path in terms of its own industrialization path and new technology and innovation. And I think the bill that's passed is very much in alliance to that is not just the right thing to do in terms of climate, but it seems to be also the right thing to do in terms of putting the US in terms of innovation in the energy sector and bringing the jobs that you need. And that is, I think, for the bilateral relationship to Brazil, but I think for other countries is the same. It teaches us two things, that most of the bilateral relationship on climate with the US and with Europe and other countries that Brazil has had has been very much linked to the stick more than the carrots. Just today, or it was yesterday, that we saw some laws in the US being passed about how the US and other countries are looking at in terms of Brazil, trying to get importation of products from Brazil that is deforestation free. Obviously, we also want to consume deforestation free goods within Brazil, but I don't think we put enough effort in terms of the carrots. And I think these give a very good signal that, yes, we will always need in terms of international relations, the sticks, they are important, but we should perhaps look and help the bilateral agreements between US and Brazil to also tackle some of the carrots. And I think there are lots of good carrots to look at in terms of transfer of technology, in terms of working together on green jobs, helping state-level governors to bring some of the capacity that they need to implement their own laws. So I think it opens up the opportunity for us to think about the cooperation between US and Brazil, very much linked on the carrots. What are the types of carrots that Brazil also needs in terms of investment? We don't have the amount of money that the US was able to put on the table to get the type of support you need in your own parliament, in the Senate House. We don't have that type of money in Brazil at the moment. So what can international cooperation do to bring the support so that we can develop, for example, green hydrogen, as was mentioned? At the moment, Brazil has been importing a lot of gas from the US. And we know the difficulties about opening up gas in Brazil, a country with so many choices of renewable sources. So thinking about which type of incentives we can have, I think would make it a big, new, fresh look on possibilities in the Brazil-US relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana, for your answer. On the issues of carrots, since we're talking about how positive incentives can improve the relationship. In other activities of this project with the US consulate in Rio, it was highlighted how the COP26 in Glasgow has several initiatives presented to help finance economies' decarbonization, which demonstrates that achieving such a goal is not a matter of scarcity of funds, but of building plans and arrangements to access and use these same funds. Do you agree with such view? And if so, what are, in your opinion, some of the most relevant areas in which Brazil should develop policy to access these funds? And I think it's back to you. And then back to Alice.
As I said, I think there are many, many areas that we can think about, carrots and also partnership, I think in both sense. In the area of science, I think this is an important area for us to look at. Low carbon agriculture is something that both countries are wanting to pursue. Brazil has a lot to teach in the low carbon agriculture. I'm sure the US has also extremely good technologies there. So I think on the low carbon technologies for agriculture is one of the areas that I think we could look much more in relation to a good exchange. The other area that's obviously on the energy, the whole issue that US perhaps is a bit further away from us on the digitalization and knowledge about efficiency, on energy efficiency. Brazil has a lot to develop in this area. on the quality and standards of equipment, on how better to use that. I think there is the type of incentives that we would need to modernize in terms of energy efficiency. A lot of our industry in many areas, that's something that we could look into. There are other areas that perhaps are less obvious ones, but I think it's something that we should consider, is on the areas that we know the US has done tremendous good work in terms of its preparedness of the military side for climate adaptation and looking at disasters and how would that work. In the case of Brazil, we have barely worked on the issues of adaptation and climate emergency. This is an area that I think we could go forward with it. And the last one that I mentioned is in the whole issues of of our products, and again, using technologies to help on how we're going to trace a lot of the products, especially in relation to deforestation. So as I said, I think there are many, many areas for us to work together with the US. And I think one of the things that probably is where the US is that more than new pledges from both countries, I think it's a time now that we need to go into implementation. Very much don't focus on implementation. And to work on implementation, we need to work at subnational level with cities, governors, and obviously the private sector. So I think the area that I would suggest that's most important for that cooperation would be with those entities from cities and state level, but as well as the private sector.
Thank you, Ana. I would just like to remind the audience that you can send your questions or Q&A. I think our team has already open for you, and we'll, if we have time, we'll make some of the questions at the end of the presentation. So now back to Alice. Could you also please comment on how the Brazil and US cooperation could affect US investments in Brazil in the coming years, please?
Yes, well, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act is really directed at US activities, but as Ana has mentioned, it could be of great help to other countries, including Brazil. One thing I should note about that bill is it has a very long runway. It's looking out 10 years, and we know that some of these technologies and efforts won't happen overnight. The bill anticipates that and makes sure that there will be continued support for the private sector for initiatives that could, as well as in the public sector, for initiatives that could change the landscape on green energy. With regard to Brazil and US cooperation, President Biden, of course, has placed conservation of the Amazon forest and other efforts to cut harmful carbon pollution at the center of its policy towards Brazil. The United States has stated under President Biden that it will continue to work with Brazil to collaborate on the protection and preservation of the environment, because both countries are among the top 10 polluters, emitters in the world. So there's a lot that both countries can work on together to correct the climate challenge. And historically, there's been a lot of cooperation between and investment by the US government and Brazil. Of course, fighting climate change has been a concern, building capacity among Brazilian stakeholders, and encouragement of ambitious targets to be presented at the UN meetings. Fire prevention and management, a challenge that both countries face. And one of the interesting things that in the United States with regard to wildfires that are worsened by climate change, there's a lot of effort going in to make sure that our firefighters understand that these fires are different, understand the dynamics and what's needed to address them. So working with specialized Brazilian entities to build capacity and invest in fire prevention, investigation, and management programs could be beneficial to the United States. Our development agency, the USAID, has supported a fire management program for the 2021 fire season with that aim in mind. It wants to increase capacity to identify the origin of fires and then, of course, address them. Another area is promoting sustainable forest economies. And of course, this would be mostly an emphasis on the conservation of the Amazon forest and its biodiversity. Again, we've had a partnership, the USAID, PCAB, I think it's called, is a $10 to $15 million per year initiative to promote sustainable economic growth in Brazil of its protective areas. I think the official name is the Partnership for the Conservation of Amazon Biodiversity. There's a lot the two nations can learn from each other about protecting the urban environment. We have vulnerable populations, and we are just now learning about the best ways to notify populations, get money to them to help them to evacuate and preserve their livelihoods. So there's a chance here for us to share best practices as each nation confronts problem or challenges that it's never confronted before. That's one of the hardest things about climate change is that you've just had a terrible hurricane, as we had in Florida, Hurricane Ian. We tend to think that's going to be the worst hurricane that could hit us, or the wildfires in the American West. But of course, with climate change fueling those events, we have worse ahead. And how do we plan for worsening events and learn from each other so we're not reinventing the wheel all the time? Another area is combating conservation crimes, building law enforcement capacity to address that. As said, responding to environmental disasters in urban areas as well as others. That's something that our military forces are being called upon with ever greater frequency to respond. The United States prides itself on being one of the world's first, if not the first, humanitarian emergency responder. But there's concern that as these events become more frequent, what does that mean for the United States military in its primary mission of securing the nation? So, but there's certainly a lot to be shared about how to better respond to disasters, and then promoting better management of public lands so that we're figuring out better ways to protect that, which is already in the public domain. So we can have a lot of technical dialogues that's been discussed, and just partner in ways as these two large nations address this critical need to cut emissions, cut pollution, carbon pollution, and then also figure out better ways to adapt to what's already happened and what will continue to happen even if we cut our emissions to zero tomorrow.
Thank you, Alice. You mentioned right in the beginning of your last answer the Amazon, right? The issue of Amazon. So my next question will be one particular area of interest for U.S. A green investment previously mentioned in this project was the Pan-Amazonic initiatives to realize the Amazon is much more than just Brazil. Other countries are involved as well. It was highlighted how the current geopolitical context may foster the realization of this kind of investments, considering the recent electoral victories in South America, open up the possibility for alignments among center-left governments in Colombia, Peru, Chile, and potentially, let's wait until next Sunday, Brazil. So how do you see the U.S. interest in the Pan-Amazonic initiatives? And are there any particular areas of development that the U.S. may be interested in investing in the future of this issue, please?
Well, the U.S. Remains interested in Pan-Amazonian efforts. Look, climate change, when it comes in, it doesn't honor the jurisdictional boundaries that humans have crafted over this millennia. It just crosses borders. So we need to have regional approaches that address the regional threats. And the President Biden signed an executive order almost immediately after he was sworn into office. And that executive order called for the development of a plan to promote the conservation of the Amazon rainforest and the other critical ecosystems that act as carbon sinks. They absorb CO2 and in a way that reduces the accumulation in the atmosphere. And the White House very early on issued this plan, which was a first of its kind for the US government. And it has the goal of leveraging our leadership in the United States to
I think she froze.
Doing that through diplomatic channels, through policy and finance mechanisms. So I think that it's safe to say that the US would want to continue to work with Amazon countries. It has a plan, and there are a number of objectives to the plan. Unfortunately, they require our Congress to provide money. That will remain to be seen. We have an election coming forward, whether that will be important to the incoming Congress. But there are lots of ways that, again, the two nations could work together on this issue.
Thank you, Alice. Now, Ana, back to you. How do you see the Brazilian appetite for such Pan-Amazonic initiatives, be it on the governmental or other spheres?
Before, Feliciano, before I talk about the Pan-Amazonic, I just want to make a comment on U.S.-Brazil overall bilateral relationship. My feeling is that from both sides, it is not 100% clear what is the Brazil foreign policy related to the U.S., nor the U.S. Exactly goes in its foreign policy in relation to Brazil, and which place the issue of climate change or environmental conservation, what's the place within that relationship. I think this is something that both countries still need to do. I know it has been Biden has had a handful of also international problems with now the Ukraine war and relationship to China and so on and so forth, but it's not clear from who sits in this side what are the objectives and priorities of the Biden administration in relation to Latin America as a whole, if I may say so, but in Brazil in particular, and what the role of climate change in that relationship is. And the same with Brazil, because as we know, the present government in Brazil had one relationship to the US because of Trump, and with the changing governments in the US, I think our objectives in relation to the US has also changed, and we haven't placed a climate within that spectrum. So I think this is a job that still needs to be done. And perhaps after our election in Brazil on Sunday and after the US election on the 8th of November is something that both countries need to do. And I wish that sitting together as those two countries and decide exactly what long-term relationships we wanted to have in both countries and what is the role of protection of the environment and fighting against climate change that takes is a must. It is a must so that we can think about long-term relationship in some of the areas that Alice mentioned in terms of cooperation. I think without that, the cooperations that we have from both sides become punctual on needs from one side or the other, but it's not something that we have in terms of structure. And the reason why I mentioned that, because that has to do with the Pan-Amazonic interest. I think both countries have an interest to look at the issue of Pan-Amazonic. Brazil does know that the problems of the Amazon that we have at the moment with illegal deforestation does not stop in the borders of Brazil. We saw the level of illegalities that is happening in the Amazon with narco trafficking, illegal logging, illegal exploration of the mining, illegal mining. That goes beyond the Brazilian border, has a strong relationship with the other Pan-Amazonic countries, and therefore a much more broader objective there is important for Brazil, because we do care about what's happening in our borders. And I know from the US side, that broader view, not only because of conservation issues, but also because of security issues, is something that the US has always worked with. But that should be within the priorities laid down for a longer term relationship among the two countries. And I think what is actually missing at the moment is that long-term view, and especially in a moment of a lot of instabilities in geopolitics in the world, with Europe having a war inside of the region, the tensions between US and China, having that long-term view for the continent, for the Americans, is really, really important for the two biggest countries in the region. And I don't think we have had that opportunity to prioritize that relationship as much as we need to do in the future.
Thank you very much. And now moving to our another issue of science technology issues that already come up with both Alice and Anna answers. In other panels of this project, it was highlighted how technological innovation, particularly digital transformation, are essential for achieving decarbonization, and it may be an avenue of particular interest for both Brazil and United States. And I make the question for the both of you. I think Alice can go first and then Anna afterwards. Do you agree that digital innovation have an important role in strengthening Brazil-US cooperation on climate and environmental issues? Could you comment on what areas do you see greater potential for the consolidation of this cooperation? Please, Ms. Alice, you have the floor.
Well, absolutely. I think that it's clear that digital innovation has a significant role to play when it comes to climate change. The World Economic Forum has projected that digital solutions in just 3 sectors, energy, materials, and mobility, could reduce global emissions by up to 20%. But that's not going to be even across countries. As developed economies invest heavily in green energy, developing countries may struggle to introduce technology-driven, climate-friendly policies and actions. They cost money. And you have to have access to the technology, and sometimes it's protected. So this again is something that I believe the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act will help with. It will help drive domestic or US technological innovation in a dramatic way. We've already seen reports of companies investing heavily in anticipation of this support from the federal government in wind energy and other clean energy, carbon capture and storage. So as these companies build out their knowledge, their skills, and the technology that's available, it will provide an opportunity for the US over that decade-long time to share its development with countries like Brazil. So it's an opportunity for us to deepen the partnership that Anna references, to try to get at what can the United States share? And I think it's known for some of its technological prowess that could help other countries, and therefore strengthen the cooperation between the countries as we see information and communications technology, green energy expand over the years. And you will see that we've had with our U.S. Export-Import Bank and the Brazilian Ministry of Economy, they've signed a memorandum of understanding to deploy up to $1 billion in financing to support U.S. exports. Again, there is some goals here for the U.S. to Brazil in the 5G space and other sectors. So this is evolving. The legislation is very new, but it is a growth area for us domestically, but also in the international world in building and strengthening our connections with other nations, including Brazil.
Now, back to you, please.
No, I think Alison was quite comprehensive on her answer. And obviously, the whole issue of digitalization, science, innovation is key for fighting climate. So more cooperation that Brazil has with all countries, that will be extremely welcome. I think for us, some of the areas that obviously would be very much we're looking into it. As I said, the whole issue of the new bioeconomy, new products from resource base, from the forest. This is an area that Brazil needs to invest much more. We are betting that Brazil has a comparative advantage in a lot of the resource base for new materials that we have, but we haven't transformed our comparative advantage into competitive advantage, because a lot of that the knowledge to make sure that goes from knowledge, creation of knowledge, to innovation, and finally to startups and products, we're still in that development. So this is an area that I hope the US will help in terms of its cooperation, investing in science and technology for the area of the bioeconomy and the new materials that we want. Energy is an obvious one. In energy, there's a lot of offshore wind, wind in general, and solar. We already have that technology in place. It's much more on disseminating that energy use through digital. There are changes in our own legislation. We need to do that more so that we can use the knowledge that has been built. And I think one of the areas that I hope in terms of the cooperation between US and Brazil is investing in our universities and research bodies that we have in Brazil. We do know Brazil has excellent scientists, has always built a very strong science base. Unfortunately, in the last years, the science budget of Brazil has diminished tremendously in key areas of development. So I think one area of cooperation should be investing in science and in our own universities that at the moment, and for the bioproducts in particular that I just talked about.
Thank you, Ms. Anna, for your answer. Now I'd like to move to our final topic on this panel, which is climate justice and society. The intersection of race, gender, and other social issues with climate change cannot be treated as appendix to the confrontation of the global climate emergency. So I have a question for the both of you. I think we could start with Alice and then back to Anna. Can you comment on the intersectionality of these issues and how it has been addressed in US or Brazil for US for Alice and Brazil for Anna? And how do you see could improve in the future? Are there any lessons to be learned between Brazil and US in this matter? We also received a question from the audience from Mariana Buqueca, who is a fellow at CEBRI and a professor at Federal University of Rio. And she makes almost the same questions to Ms. Hill. How do you access the current development climate just in US? Are climate and racial issues more interconnected than in the past few years? Ms. Ellis, you have the floor, please.
Well, the answer to that question is yes. President Biden came into office with a goal of promoting climate justice, equity issues, and he has delivered in terms of producing policies and executive orders that reflect that. He set out as one of his very early goals to launch the most ambitious, this is a quote, environmental justice agenda ever undertaken by the federal government. And so they've created committees, they've created advisory councils within the White House, within the agencies, a government-wide Justice 40 initiative, which aims to provide 40% of the overall benefits of federal spending relating to climate change, clean energy, and other areas to disadvantaged communities. So a lot has been done to address this issue. During his tenure, it's also been uncovered that there are policies in place that have had unjust results. For example, our cost-benefit analysis typically has valued property over people. And so disadvantaged communities don't own as much property. And if you value the property, you make your investments in the areas where the expensive property is, but that means that disadvantaged communities don't access as much money. So there's a lot of work afoot to try to think through what may have been an unintended consequence, but has been proven to be particularly challenged. And this effort couldn't be more important. You know, it's shown that disasters, and we're going to have a lot more of them with climate change, hit poor communities, communities of color, and women and girls harder. Disasters kill at a much higher rate in poor communities and in poor nations, and we need to address that. We saw very dramatic examples of this in this latest hurricane, which was the largest, looks like the largest insurance loss in the history of the United States. Losses is maybe 70 billion, Hurricane Ian, which hit Florida. And we saw higher numbers of people killed. And many of those people were elderly people. They just couldn't move as quickly. They didn't have the means or the ability to evacuate, and they drowned in their homes. So there is a lot of work to be done here. And it's also we need to have a greater focus on gender issues. We have poorer outcomes for women and girls. The UN has estimated that women and girls are 14 times more likely to die in natural disasters than men and boys, women and children, so than men. That's something we have to address. And that is globally, but we have the same challenge here for indigenous populations. They just suffer more. And the Biden administration has said it's determined to do the right thing, address these issues, and also build in accountability for itself and communities as to what they're doing. It's still early on. We don't know the full outcomes, but certainly the will has been expressed to finally put this at the forefront of the agenda as it needs to be.
Thank you, Alice. Anna, to you.
God, I'm very, very jealous of Alice and the discussion and the level of discussion, not only discussion, but actions that the US have taken to put the issue of a just transition on the top of that agenda. And as you said, this is really, I mean, it has to be that way, because climate change, as we all know, is an accelerator of inequalities, is an accelerator of vulnerability, and the people that are most vulnerable already, or they will become even more vulnerable going forward. Unfortunately, in the case of Brazil, we are not only very, very far on this discussion in relation to the debate. What is a just transition for Brazil? What does it mean? Which sectors? The whole debate in terms of adaptation versus mitigation, how cities are relating to the huge disasters that we see time and time again in cities when there is events of climate events that are big, either too much rain or droughts, the first ones to suffer. And people are not yet in Brazil making the links between those climate events with climate change. So it's as if this is just God will, and some poor people again have to suffer, the ones that are most vulnerable. So we are so far in this debate in Brazil. Unfortunately, we have an adaptation law that started in 2015, a plan for that we don't have money specifically devoted to that. The debate with mayors and governors in terms of disaster preparedness, in terms of protecting and preventing that poor people will suffer yet again, is really, really far from that. And we don't as yet have that coming into play. So I think we have a lot to learn, not only from the US, how you have done that, but from countries like South Africa, who has just now passed a big law in a plan and received $8 billion in terms of support from abroad. That is a just transition plan for South Africa. We saw in Indonesia, they also have a just transition plan. So I think I see many, many countries putting forward a just transition plan to protect vulnerable people, to think about policies that will make the transition more just. And that's the way forward. Brazil needs to do that. We do not have anything like a just transition plan. We don't have a commission like they have in South Africa. We are learning a lot from other countries. And I'm very hopeful that in another government, we will be able to do such a thing. Because as you said, this is a priority. That should be the first thing for us to do, is what a just transition looks like. Where are the plans for that? How much does it cost? How are we going to protect lives? We don't have that at the moment.
Thank you, Ana, for your answer. I think now we move to our last questions before we open for the audience. We have our audience of almost 100 people between here and YouTube. To both of you, I think this is an issue that has already been mentioned by Ana and by Alice, which is how do you see the current level of bilateral cooperation happening at the subnational, private, and civil society levels between Brazil and US? Which of these areas do you see as having more potential to increase and strengthen the bilateral cooperation in the future, and why? So, Ms. Alice, back to you.
Well, our countries both have big elections coming up that will decide the direction to some extent. Ours isn't a presidential election, but it's certainly related to our Congress and which party in a two-party system could be in control of that Congress, and that could affect the policy, and it could affect the ability of the Biden administration to march out on the policies that it's already announced, because there could be investigations and other questions raised if the Republicans take office. And some Republican members have said that's their intent if they, for example, regain control of the House of Representatives. So we have some question marks about what our political landscape will look like. We also have races going on, as has been mentioned, at the state and local level, governorships. So those those entities are very important in the issue of just transition, of clean energy, of cutting emissions. So they're part of this national effort that needs to take place. So we won't know until those elections have taken place what direction. And because in the United States, in our two-party system, the two parties diverge significantly on issues of climate change policy. So that's ahead. But we also know the private sector needs to play a significant role as we move forward on issues of climate change. As our special envoy, John Kerry for climate says, there's just not enough money. No government has enough money to do what we need to do with regard to climate. So governments could be attempting to make it a more attractive environment for companies to invest, but certainly going forward, we need to involve the private sector in finding solutions. And also we need to involve the private sector in making sure that they understand what's at stake. And so we see efforts internationally for accounting rules to change, for taxonomies to be developed that would require companies to look at their emissions, but also the risk from the physical impacts. And as those evolve over time, I think it will, and there's greater understanding within the C-suite, the highest levels of companies, we could see greater interest in companies both cutting their emissions, preparing for the impacts, but also importantly, making investments that bring returns that keep us all safer and are part of our climate action efforts.
Thank you, Alice. Anna, back to you.
I mean, in relation specifically to subnationals and cooperation among subnationals, I wanted to say, I think we talked about some of the areas of priorities. I think prevention of disasters and support policies related to just transition at state level and city level, it is an area that we can do a lot together, independently of the elections that are coming in Brazil and obviously in the US. I think there is enough will from enough states in both countries that are wanted and to do that type of relationship and will need to deal with disasters prevention as well as a more just transition, because they are facing that problem. I think one of the areas that I think we needed to look at, and I think Alice already mentioned, is on the economic incentives, back to the carrots. So, for example, in the Amazon, there are lots of good forest-related products, Amazon products, that could be incentivized and could be seen and have a priority to be imported by the US that would help local people, local producers, also to prevent deforestation. So which products are they? Nuts, or acai, God knows which ones. But let us look in terms of trade, what can be incentivized in terms of good forest products that could be given incentives or less taxes to come into the US that would give the states in the Amazon more ability to export some of those products to, for example, the United States. We talked a lot about cooperation, and we did have the Amazon Fund. Unfortunately, the US was not yet one of those funders of the Amazon Fund at the time. Obviously, we all know about the controversies of the Amazon Fund, and the Amazon Fund, unfortunately, has been stopped in Brazil for this last period. But the Amazon Fund used to be a really important vehicle to support local level governments and cities on a lot of the issues that we are talking about, how to prevent deforestation. So we could perhaps in the future, again, use the Amazon Fund as an instrument. And if we can't, because of problems that as we have at the moment, then I can see that at local level, state level funds are being set up by state governors. And I think this is a vehicle that I hope, in terms of cooperation, that the US government can use much more of state level funds to have cooperation with state governors very much willing to stop deforestation, and that doesn't have a means to do so. And I think we need to find ways, if not through the big Amazon fund, directly to those governors. So I think I very much feel there is enough private sector effort as well as state level efforts, both in Brazil and in the US, that independently of where the two federal governments are going, and which type of support that they will have, that we have to incentivize much more of that relationship.
Thank you, Ana. Thank you, Ms. Alice and Ms. Alice Hill and Ms. Ana Tony for your answer of this panel. We still have some 5 minutes here. We received more than 10 questions from the audience. I was like going through here to pick a couple of very controversial ones for you to answer. So let me see. I have 2 questions from Professor Matias Spector, who is a professor at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation and is currently a professor at Princeton University and also a fellow at CEBRI. There's one question to Alice, and the question is, what are the odds of the Inflation Reduction Act leading to a carbon border tax? And to Ana, Matias' question is this: what is the role of Brazil's National Development Bank, BNDES, in securing finance for US-Brazil joint work on curbing deforestation? And I think I have a final question to Ana, if she's have enough time and if she's able to answer. How do you think that this presidential election in Brazil can affect the cooperation in these areas between these two countries? So, Ms. Alice, you have the floor, and then go back to Ana, and we wrap up the panel. Thank you very much again.
Well, I don't know what the odds are. I can't give you that, but I do know that carbon border adjustment mechanism is still something that has been of interest to this administration. I've forgotten exactly, maybe it was the G7 or the G20, but the Biden administration made an announcement that they were working on that idea. And I would anticipate that as we move forward and we are seeing whether we're going to get regulation on disclosure, whether some of these other efforts to drive greater transparency with regard to what are the costs involved with climate change, whether that will move forward. Certainly, it's been a often cited dream among academic communities. If we could just get a carbon tax, we could take care of this globally, we could take care of this, and the United States has not been able to. It has on a occasionally on a regional basis, but not on, it has not achieved that. So I think their effort to do it another way through carbon border adjustment mechanism is not dead, and it will be pursued as we learn globally more about the damages from climate change. I think there'll be greater interest in driving faster consideration of the issues of how much carbon is embedded in the products that we're using. So I would say stay tuned. There could be more coming.
Thank you, Alice. Now, I forgot to mention the question about the election was made by Pedro Guimarães. I forgot to mention his name. Ana, please, you have the floor now. The final comment.
Now, just listening to Alice on carbon taxes versus carbon adjustment at borders, very different approaches with a lot of consequences for countries outside the US that export to the US. So yes, we'll stay tuned to see the developments there. But in terms of BNDES, Matias, I started already answering. I think the BNDES has been an excellent instrument in the past with the Amazon Fund and could go, for many other areas, not only for the Amazon Fund. But I wouldn't, because of the traumas of the last 4 years and what has happened with BNDES and the Amazon Fund in particular on climate change, I hope the BNDES will be a very important instrument for the US-Brazilian cooperation, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in one single basket. So I think there are other development banks in Brazil, regional ones, state level ones, and I wish that the US cooperation will use them as well. So not just staying with BNDES, yes, BNDES, but the other development banks as well, depending on which states are more willing to go forward, especially on the climate change related policies there. So we could have that as a criteria as well. In terms of the election, well, there's a great question, but I do think that the Brazilian election can be very, very influential about the cooperation between US and Brazil going forward and in a much becoming stronger and be more speedy or not. I think we have seen in the last 2 years the relationship between the present government with Bolsonaro and the US started on the wrong footing with the Brazilian president supporting Trump. And I don't think we have a strong relationship between the Bolsonaro government and the Biden administration. It's diplomatic, it's polite, as diplomacy should be. And I think the US will be always open to foster cooperation. But I wouldn't say that we have a very strong and comprehensive relationship to the US at the extent we could have, and especially on the climate issues. The distrust of not only the US government, but for the international community as a whole, from the Bolsonaro administration on environmental issues is an obvious one, is a strong one, and will continue to be very strong if Bolsonaro is re-elected, just because of the numbers of deforestation, about the policies against indigenous people, and so on and so forth. I don't think that we can change. But if there is a change in government in Brazil with Lula, I think that will make climate will be a priority for Lula, is a priority obviously for Biden. So I think the relationship between US and in Brazil will become much stronger and will have climate as one pillar of that cooperation as we wish that to be. I think that's very important that US and Brazil have a much stronger relationship and having climate at the center of it. So let us see what's happening on Sunday and obviously on the 9th of November in the US. And we'll know our cards better at that point.
Thank you very much, Ana. I'd like if Alice or Ana would like to give the make final comments on the presentation. Alice, back to you.
Well, I think we've heard there's lots of opportunity here. And the question is whether we'll seize that opportunity or whether we will not move forward on climate action. So the stakes couldn't be higher, in my opinion, for this at this particular moment for both countries. And my hope is that they're working together, collaborating, having partnerships, finding the bilateral strength, and working globally to address the climate crisis.
Anna, please.
And I think my final word is bilateral relationships are based in trust. As they always go on different players. And I think we need to foster that trust, especially on obviously the issues that we are talking about here, climate. So as Alice said, it's a lot at stake. And I think we need just to go forward in developing trust, wherever trust is possible. So if it's possible, the federal government, let us foster that. If it's not, let us trust with subnationals, private sector, but we need to go forward with this objective of both countries fighting side by side to combat climate change.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be part of this panel. So I'd like to thank Ms. Alice Hill for the participation, the Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to also participate our great fellow and great colleague, Anna Toni, for her participation in this panel. Remember, everybody, that this is a part of a project, a joint project between CEBRI and the U.S. Consulate in Rio, called America in the World, the U.S. Foreign Policy and the Brazilian View on the Bilateral Agenda. Stay tuned for our next for the next panel on this bilateral relationship. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.